resistor drill. It's this. So if you remember, perturbation complexity index is a way to quantify the evoked spatial temporal complexity that the system exhibits when it's perturbed, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's something about dynamics of the system, how a system behaves under a certain external intervention. While phi is not something about like the dynamics or something you observe, right? It's about this kind of like potential structure of constraints. So working this kind of like formal relationship between the dynamics of a system and its
General space, right?
Yeah, like cause effect structure, it's not something trivial, but it could be done.
Mm-hmm.
But what is interesting is that the PCI, like methodologically, was inspired by the principles of IIT. So even though like the fact that PCI works doesn't demonstrates IIT at all, because other theories it's consistent, like coherent with PCI. The fact that it was like developed using like the axioms and the postulates and trying to like coming from that intuition, it's kind of an interesting way to like show that you're kind in the at least the reasoning you're using is leading to like productive and useful measures.
I was the last presentation had me thinking a lot about the very speculative question: does the economy think? Is an economy conscious in this sense? Because just thinking about this, what you just mentioned, dynamics versus structure, or this cause-effect structure, isn't it like when we think about price, we usually think about dynamics in the sense of how price fluctuates over time in a market, and you can kind of see it reacting to perturbations, in the sense of like crises or news events, but then it also must have a kind of structure of cause and effect as well, right? But it's just hard to disentangle the signals. So I don't know. It's very evocative, these lines here, right? Because they could correspond to brainwaves, but they could also correspond to price fluctuations.
Yeah. Like I was planning on talking like, I think that this distinction is really relevant, like this observing versus perturbing.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, maybe I can just already start talking. So like these three systems, you could probably design them in a way that in terms of dynamics, they would all look the same if you look at them. And the only way to distinguish you could like calculate like complexity on this time series, and you could like measure all sorts of things. But you wouldn't be able to distinguish these three very different causal structures just by observing. And while if you decide to do perturbations, it becomes really simple to distinguish them, because, for example, this system, once you perturb it, and you do this in a repetitive way, you can see that the other nodes won't react, right? So in these other cases, you try to perturb one of the nodes and you get like the whole network reacts, but there's no differentiation going on. So each one receives a signal and does the same thing that everyone else. So you don't have, you're completely degenerate. And then what you observe is actually like a fully stereotypical signal across space. So the two interesting things, I think, is one that you can certainly get a lot of like causal and structural information just by setting a system in a certain state and doing that again and again, like an experiment, and seeing how it behaves as opposed to just like passively observing. And the other thing is that systems can hide like rare states that could actually play like a very big role. So So like transitions between rare states to like certain like decisions wouldn't be seen in observed like passive observer of history. Like most relevant things that happen, for example, in history are about like really rare events in which like people just wait for the right moment to happen and then for a certain decision to be taken. So most of the time you cannot discern like what a system is in terms of its causal powers, because you don't get to observe like the decisive kinds of transitions that the system is able to make because of its mechanisms, and because they're just like too rare to be observed. So from an observational point of view, you don't have like the tools to discern these two kinds of really different systems, I think. So.
You know what? Really, it's a kind of stupid idea, but I just realized, like, if imagine these are musical tones, if let's say if these are not in the harmonics of this, when you play that note, the others won't vibrate. If these are octaves, when you play one, they will all vibrate on the same note, so it won't get any added information. But if you play this and the others are within the overtone series of this tone, they will react in different frequencies, you know? Like it looks like
this
that
depends,
distinction.
This depends a bit on the material, right? Like if you have strings, of course, this is the case. If you are vibrating like a bronze surface, no, it will have a different set of partials than the harmonic series.
Ah, okay. Yeah, but it just seemed like a very nice distinction, you know, like.
Yeah, of course. I understand where you're coming from. Just because it depends on the physical system at that place, right? But yeah, the harmonic series model is appropriate for a perpendicular column of air, or for a string, something like that. Yes.
How? Hey, can I make drawings? Yeah. How does this work? Yeah, I don't know if it's related to what you just said, but there's this interesting phenomena that we observe with TMS. So, like, how can I? Which is, well, I mean, so TMS is this, right? So it's this magnetic stimulation, and depending on where you like stimulate the brain, you get something that like we call natural frequencies, which is like the kind of like natural frequency at which a certain like site reacts to. And there's this interesting like variation from front to back, that you get fast frequencies in the front and slower frequencies in the back. So one way you could explain, so you get like alpha frequencies, which is, I think is, I don't remember, 10 hertz or something. And then you start to get like faster oscillations in the front, depending on where you like. So you could imagine like this building that it's made of like different densities and different like has a different structure. And if you knock in a certain in the frontal part, which is like more finer, you get like some faster frequencies, and in the back it's like slower and heavier. So there are like two ways to explain once you knock. It could be that just each system is reacting on its own frequency. Like he's just doing his local like natural frequency, and he's just like, he just doesn't care. He just like receives something and just like reacts in his own way. Or there could be ways in which he's actually like reacting with his natural frequency plus the other guy's frequency and doing something like non-linear, which is not the same as just like a linear combination of either his own self or something else. I guess he does something more interesting. So, and this is kind of hard to distinguish just like by knocking in one place, and just like you would have to be able to see if just like a model we just like consider sums of local productions could explain it, or if like synergetic terms across the nodes appear, which cannot like be explained just by local behaviors. I mean, related to this, there's, I think a nice intuition that there's this paper that the guy did. It was like an algorithm to reconstruct the architecture of a space just by like recording like echoes of the space. So he would do like, he could infer from the reverberations the kind of like room the person was in. So it's kind of like PCI, right? You sound an alarm and see how that vibrates, and if the vibration is complex, you can infer you're in like a complex environment rather than like a circular. He actually tested that in, I think, in the Notre Dame, and distinguished it from like I don't know, like a circular space.
That's really cool. Also, just before we move on, I also think it's important to just so we can also discuss this later on. In Apolito's text, right, she brings this whole discussion of the phi function and the integrated information in terms of a measure for an optimization process, right? Mm-hmm. Her whole point is that there would be an intrinsic relation between maximizing integration and maximizing cooperation over competition. Like, she makes this basic assumption that competition tends to create disconnected parts, tends to decrease, let me see if I can find it here. She says, maximizing our integrated information favors cooperation over competition, since competition tends to break apart a system into separate competitors, and this decreases the phi function, while cooperation increases connectedness and enlarges the network of mutual causal influences, leading to an increase of phi. Also, a mechanism that maximizes phi would wipe out abhorrent phenomena like intellectual property, since keeping knowledge inaccessible decreases its causal connectedness, decreasing the overall value of phi. I now see that she's trying to come up with a measure, like a quantitative measure for general intellect, right? So Marx talks about the general intellect, so let's actually apply a theory of consciousness to the economy and see if, how intelligent can the whole be if there is things like intellectual property or barriers on things like this. I think that's kind of the vulgar version of her argument.
That's a good point, yeah.
So I'm just saying this because you asked, Dennis, about what would it mean to apply this formalism to economic systems? And I think that Apolito's argument is that viewed from this perspective, you would probably get a low degree of integration. Like, so this is a measure of complexity where our crazy capitalist complex system actually would do poorly, wouldn't do well. Like, it would look like it's not very rich from this perspective, right? So I think that's a bit of her thesis, like the background. So I think it's useful to just to mention it so we can also bring it to the picture at some point, right?
Yeah. I think I lost a little bit of your audio, so can you just point me to the place you're reading in the text?
Yeah, sure. Is my audio better now?
I don't know if it was my connection or your audio.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you okay. I think it was only one or two sentences it cut,
okay.
But
it's just this part here of the text, this actual paragraph here.
Actually, shouldn't we have a meeting about this particular text at some point, or maybe before I came in you already had one? I'm not sure.
Yeah, we could. I think that before Renzo
it's
presented,
a great text.
This is relevant, right? I mean, super relevant.
Yeah, we didn't separate a day to talk about it yet.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I'm interested, so.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah,
it's kind of a core text of this group, I think.
Yeah. Also, I think, yeah, but though I think that we kind of distinguished parts of it for different presentations. Like, when we spoke of Karatani, we basically developed the part of this text where she talks about scale threshold, information threshold, and this sort of history of systems. There is this open gap. I was talking to Raquel earlier about discussing like the use of mathematics by economists, and a good chunk of this text is about Leontiev and that part. So I don't know, at some point we could bring it all together, right?
Yeah, I think that would be a super presentation. I think that would interest a lot of people outside of the group as well.
In any case, this is the part where that I mentioned, where she says she sees this as a viable measure for an optimization process. And this idea here that this would imply, which I think this is actually here is a complicated issue, because she's treating competition as the opposite of cooperation. And in Marx, things are, at least for Marx, things are not so simple, right? Because competing is, let's say, a way of relating by distincting. It's not like a way of disconnecting, right? Competition, I think when we were talking about this, Raquel, this was already at play, right? The competition is a form of coordination. It's not like just kind of islands of capitalists, right? Or things like this.
And I think we can think that it's like the whole, the capital as a whole appears as competition, as competition between individual capitals. So when Dennis was saying that maybe we can think about the economy as a whole, thinking something, I don't know if it's possible, because what appears, the whole, only appears as individual capitals competing between themselves. So I don't know. I really don't know if we can say something like that, because we don't have the individual capital doesn't have the whole information. I don't know. I have to listen to Hansel a bit more too.
Yeah, I also don't have a good approach to this. I just think that this is a stronger, more complex statement than it looks like. You know, like to say that we should strive for this increase in this phi measure, if you focus on this, you're actually focused on increasing competition, increasing cooperation over competition. I think it's a good question, because at the same time, I think Marx is very good at showing that there was never an increase in cooperation as there was under competition. So workers never cooperated at the surplus cooperation in a factory, the amount of, let's say, non-subjective or forced cooperation, even if you want, that you get in a factory because of the capitalist way of organizing production, is definitely an increase in comparison with before. And so competition might be more ambiguous than simply, you know, saying something like cooperation increases connectedness and competitors are broken apart, like separate a system into parts and cooperation unites them. Because I mean, I just think it's a big statement. I'm not sure what to do about it, but it seems important for her argument. And I think that there is a discussion on this, right? Which is not so
obvious. For me, it doesn't make a lot of sense, this particular statement. Like, all the liberal argument is that competition has enough integration in order to make for, you know, lower prices, aren't they? Isn't that the argument? Like, doesn't it have to do with competition and integration in a sense? Like, the competition itself is making the integration as to lower the price, something like that?
Yeah, that's actually really close to Hayek's argument, right? In that use of knowledge text, where he does explicitly say that the market integrates what he calls like transitory knowledge, or like kind of this knowledge on the spot where that cannot be formalized, right?
I think a way, perhaps a way of saying this would be to say something like a different way of putting something like this, which is perhaps more sophisticated, is to say, well, competition is a form of integration, but it has a certain upper bound, you know, and then you would have to show that there are limits to competition that there aren't for cooperation. And then you could say, but then the level of complexity of one could be higher than the other, rather than saying that one points in one direction and the other points in the other direction. It would be a slightly different argument, right? But anyway, this is where that's where I saw the place to, you know, that she mentions this. So I think it's useful just to have that in mind, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you want to share your screen again, man,
Yeah, I'm not really sure I understood either what she meant. I have to re-go through the text also to see, because I'm not sure if she means like in terms of like if you were to like try to picture how like, I don't know, like companies are organized in like into a graph, you get like a certain, like I have like this it's like this nice image from one of Ho's paper. And I mean, it's not actually like it's without the interpretation of the figure, but like if you were to imagine like different graphs that represented like the productive structure, I don't know if what she means is that like competitiveness produces just like centralization into like every like like hubs of nodes of decision in which I don't know is like I don't know what is the structure that's being analyzed for her, if it's like a productive structure or like the way price centralizes like all exchanges.
I think you're right, because it's also important to remember that she's coming from a more anarchist perspective. So let's say the central point is more power and hierarchical structures than value and price and, let's say, economic dynamics, right? So probably she has that. I think that it would be more obvious in that sense, right? That hierarchies in companies and also large scale, they limit the level of connectiveness because they get like the basic tree form, right, of an organogram or something like this. I think at that level, it would be easier to understand. But at the same time, she's talking about economy and economic planning. So I don't know, there is some, I agree with you. It's not very easy to understand like most of the text is dealing with finding the right, let's say, theory of complexity, the right measure of complexity for knowing if we are on the right track or not, and for knowing where to invest and where not to invest in terms of strategy, right? Like she comes up at the end with this idea of two basic organizational instruments that increase complexity, instruments that increase connectivity, and that would be, let's say, the things to be valued. But the fact that she found a measure doesn't mean that we have a clear view of what is being measured, right? So, yeah. So there's that, yeah.
But yeah, maybe I don't know. I was just planning on just reviewing all the ideas to see if if they make sense in a second go. But I don't have like any much new. Like I was almost over in the last time, so it's there's not much new to show.
But I think it's a good idea to go over it again just to make sure we are
okay. So I thought a different way to like just present the problem, which I think it's nice, is to like take this supervenience principle, which is like surprisingly like widely accepted, like in philosophy, within scientists, like which just says it's this relation that says that it's a form of dependency relationship in which every difference in experience must imply a difference in the physical substrate, right? So it's impossible to have like two experiences, two forms of like subjective experiences in which they are different, but there's no physical difference going on. Because the problem with that is that then you would have to explain that difference without appealing to like physical differences, and then you would like get into trouble. So but this principle also allows that there are many ways. Differences in physical subject doesn't imply differences in experiences, right? So there might be differences in the physical universe that doesn't count for, so given a certain experience, say my own, and then you have the whole universe. The question of the way I see it, the question the theory of consciousness is trying to answer is explaining like what kinds of differences in the physical world produces which differences in experience. So because I mean, from the first person perspective, there's nothing outside in the world that would like, there's no, it's like the human argument that there's no like necessary connection in between these regularities you observe in experience and a real like causal world outside. So it's kind of like surprising in a certain sense that there is a certain region in the physical world that if I destroy, I will stop experiencing what I'm experiencing, which is like somewhere in the brain, right? So there seems to be like privileged places in the universe for each subjective experience. There are like privileged boundaries in the world that define places in which if you make differences, then there are differences that will follow in your experience. So,
hey, I have a question about actually sort of along these lines, about this like region where the differences make a difference in relation to like the perturbation, right? Is that going to be the same region that you have to, I guess, like do the perturbation on to like measure the system?
yes, I mean, one of the most like what's considered like gold standard ways in neuroscience to like show that something is part of the neurocorrelates of consciousness, of the physical substrate of consciousness, is one lesion studies, like studies in which if you like cut something out, you lose something experience. So if you like destroy V1, you suddenly like you get blind. So if you destroy like places in auditory cortices, you get like deaf. And so you start to use lesions to actually like pinpoint, localize like aspects of experience into regions in the brain. So there's like this whole historical debate between like localizationist approaches and distributive approaches.
Sure.
So there's
I guess like sort of more like applied specifically to like the brain example, I guess. And where you were talking about where you like stimulate different parts and see how the like what the correlates are. If like I guess this like region of perturbation isn't like only reducible to, I guess, like the activations of the neurons, right? So maybe there's like something on some other level in the brain happening, right? That maybe we don't know about. Does that affect like what, I guess, like the integrated information results are? I don't know if that makes sense.
You're talking about more like the scale of the activation that you're doing, like the scale.
Yeah, I guess like this type of perturbation theory, like if you have the wrong region or like a smaller region, because we know obviously like neurons have to do something with consciousness and thought, but like I don't know if we know that like their activations per se necessarily are. The reason I'm thinking about this is because like it's the whole like question, like is like neural networks, the way we understand them to a degree, like are they generalizable in any way? I kind of tend to lean to them not being, to like general intelligence or whatever you want to call it. Does that make sense? I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Like generalizable in what sense, you mean?
Yeah, I guess I'm just like, I'm wondering, does this assume that brain states or like conscious states are always reducible to activation states of neurons?
Yeah.
Or does that have to be the case?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, most neuroscientists will see activation as the code for. So basically, like either like actual potential or like some form of activity. So yeah, so I can just like skip to that point, which is important, which is, it's similar to the observation versus perturbation thing, but it's about the difference between activity and so before like actually like addressing, there's most neurosciences will actually like map activation states, like brain states as understood as like brain activations, like some form of activity of doing something, as the correlate what has to be mapped to experience. And that's like the whole way like we think about neurons. Like when neurons fire, then something can happen in experience. And IIT is really like counterintuitive in that sense, because it does not map activity to experience. It's not, because it's not about activity, it's about the causal powers. So there's this strong dissociation in this. So one way to think about that, yeah, but first I thought it was useful to like bring like this positional accounts to like which are the way normally like causation is addressed and explained. So for example, a property like fragility, it's hard to describe in like activation in terms of activity or in behaviors, because it's not about that. Like the fact that something is fragile, it's not, it might not like, it might never break, you might never observe that it breaking, but you know it's fragile, right? So it's dispositional properties, which are like causal powers, they are described in different ways. So it's not about like firing or doing stuff. It's just about like, so I mean, the way IIT frames it, it's about like constraining and counterfactuals in the end. So the normal way that this is formalized is like an object is disposed to M when C. So it is disposed to manifest, like break, for example, when a certain stimulus appears. So it's kind of like counterfactual phrase, I think, that's normally used to explain a disposition, right? And then you could think about like the TPN as coding all dispositions of a system, like under every state, what happens next. So it's everything is, and then in terms of IIT, which is, I think is really interesting. So this is from the 3.0 person, and it really distinguishes between this idea of activity and inactivation or inactive, which are very different things. So the counterintuitive prediction is that IIT predicts that even if all the neurons in the main complex were inactive or active at a low baseline rate, they would still generate consciousness as long as they are ready to respond to incoming spikes. So being ready to respond is a disposition, right? Is a causal power. It's a form of reactivity. It doesn't mean, so it can be silent as long as it's ready to respond. So the idea would be that states that look like complete inactivity are like radically different from inactivated states in which the causal connections are in some sense lost. So
it's like I lost my train of thought. It's like through the possibility of reaction is like, that's how consciousness emerges. So it's like an emergent, but through reaction. Okay.
Yeah, it's not that it's emergent. It's just that the right description that actually captures like what makes a difference is in terms of the counterfactuals of all the potential things that could happen and the ways the system would react. So instead of just
I see. Okay.
explaining in terms of like certain function or a particular like activation that represents something. So
yeah, this is a crazy
let me see if I understand
point.
this.
What?
With the counterfactual you are using, picks up a world wherein such and such happens if there is a condition C.
Mm-hmm.
And you start from a list of such counterfactuals, like any possible outcome, and see what obtains. I'm not getting exactly what's the relationship to the counterfactual here.
Okay.
So, is the counterfactual something that you arrive at or something you start from?
So the way I was interpreting is like the TPM, which is like the transition probability matrix.
Yeah, you presented this last week. Yeah,
it's coding for all. So counterfaction is saying like X would happen if C was the case, right?
okay.
But you would ask for all. So so two things, like under C, what kinds of manifestations you would see. So that would be something like an effect repertoire. So a distribution over all manifestations. You could have like a distribution, which given that C happened, what is the distribution over M? So this would be, formally this would be like the here. So I'm sorry. Yeah, I can write it down for you. So like manifestations given. So there's this something that's also like there's this thing called do operator, which is by this guy named Julia Perot, which is it codes for this kind of like interventionist approach to probabilities. So you would put you would force the system into a certain state S. You would like it's called like as do S, and then you observe M. But what you actually observe is just a single transition, right? So that's why you have to do that multiple times. So you do that like S1 and observe M1, and then you would do that many times, and then you would extract like an empirical distribution on effects.
But then you have a boundary problem, right? You have to define the point at which you will simply say that the counterfactual obtains. Like there's a problem of induction there, right? I mean, maybe you have to use an arbitrary boundary, like if it obtains like X times, we will consider it as actual.
You mean like how do you calculate the?
How do you define? How do you define how many times it has to happen in order to be characteristic of a system, like to be considered as actual counterfactual, the counterfactual you're using?
I see, as being like an actual causal properties. Yeah, you can like statistically, you would have to have like a statistical modeling, like it's like an estimation problem of how do you estimate densities, right? So you would find like statistical criteria in which you have sampled enough the distribution. Right?
Yeah,
so
this is the issue. Yeah,
you have just like 4 possible outcomes, then maybe I don't know 40 times is enough. But that could be like it's not too hard to like in terms of like statistical.
Yeah, it's not too hard technically, but I mean it's a perennial philosophical problem. Like it could happen otherwise anytime. Like this is the real. I mean, the real cracker there, you know.
Yeah. I mean, that's the interesting part. I mean, the difference between how you calculate, like what kinds of experiments you have to do, and what the system actually. So the system doesn't need to do this experiments to actually like have these causal powers, right? It's just constraining over in potentially like maybe not infinite, but a very large amount of states that in practice you wouldn't be able. So yeah, there's this important distinction. But the idea is that the causal powers don't have to be these counterfactuals don't have to be, this counterfactual space don't have to be actually sampled by the system. The system simply is this counterfactual space. While if you, from an external point of view, were to actually like figure out what are the actual causal powers, you would face these problems of undersampling, and maybe there are states that in which you don't have access but are there, transitions that are like hidden, in which you would have to know the state space, for example, right? Maybe that's infinite. Like there are infinite amounts of differences that you can make to a system, and it's true that from externally you have to like reduce the state space into like a finite, right? So you never know if it's just the actual potential. Maybe there's like quantum phenomena, like people would suggest, that are actually making the difference. So there's always room for, yeah.
But still the crazy assumption remains, right? That if what interests us is the cause effect structure, it implies that that kind of empty or inactive situation is not the same as a deactivated situation, right? It's just one state in the space of all possible states. So it counts as conscious, right?
Yeah. Yeah, which is something like most neuroscience would have like a hard time like accepting, because it's really counterintuitive. But first,
another tricky part of this is, how do you know when the next state has occurred? Because for certain systems, like what you use as your unit of time may not always be very intuitive or natural, right?
I didn't get it.
I just mean, like, okay, for the brain, we have time 0 and time 1, right? You need both of those to make a TPM, right? You need a current and the next. So what is the unit of difference between T0 and T1? And how do you find that, like, in general?
You mean like the delta T or the state itself?
I guess is delta T the difference between time 0 and time 1 in the transition? Yeah, and then that one,
Yeah, so I mean, in theory, you would have to like calculate for all time scales, but I mean,
and then find the most effective, right?
Yeah, and then see where it's maximal. So, for example, you have certain like natural boundaries, right? So probably transitions between, like, if you sample your brain every second, the correlation between those states are really, there's some information, but I mean, say across years, if you sample like a brain every year, these transitions are probably meaningless, right? They are probably, there's no constraint between my state right now and my brain state in 1 year.
That's the trick. Like, I don't know, it's like a psychoanalysis would agree, like maybe something that happens to you 10 years ago suddenly, becomes manifested 10 years later,
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, the thing here is what is contributing. So yeah, difference between maybe history, like learning, and these kinds of like, and so take like a really like old memory that's, or some like learning process that actually constrained your brain, like through plasticity, like there's all sorts, everything you learn constrain like the weights, like the synapses, and through plasticity, everything there is coded. But what IIT is kind of like searching for is not, it's looking for like the actual differences in the present experience that's making a difference.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah, so it's not negating that it took a lot of like work through like history and learning to actually like come up with this certain mechanism, like this certain like weights in the neural network that code for like everything, but the different it's a different thing from what constraint, what past constraint, like this delta t is actually meaning like the events, like the actual events that is happening in the brain that is actually giving rise to a certain subjective experience, right? So I mean, the fact that you distinguish like the face of someone, of course you had to actually go through like history to learn that, but the quality, the phenomenal appearance of that face has some actual like in the sense of like present difference in the system, and this delta t is capturing that, like what kind of like like a certain population firing is contributing to a certain event in the next time step in the brain. So one way to see it, like you could come out of existence like suddenly and be conscious, but there's a certain small temporal scale in which this experience is being instantiated. I don't know if it's
no, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, like I just mean then what you said makes it clear that we actually can use that delta t as a tuning, as a knob, if we wanted to, for example, measure larger scale appearances, like you know, like I think Caron was talking about this in one of the presentations about like music, which at some point it no longer registers as music. Like if you stretch out a note or something, right, so much that it no longer becomes perceivable as a note, then that delta t would be, you would have to adjust that in order to say like, oh, something happened.
Yeah, exactly. I think you could think of it exactly the way you're talking about, as like I guess like the minimum time between like different brain states that like make a difference, I guess, right? Two different brain states that we consider as separate. It's not like the same state as anymore. And depending on the situation, that scale would change.
Right, and for our
so
brains,
like if you're asleep, it'd be long.
Right, it'd be longer, yeah. And it's like, there would be an evolutionary reason for your choice of t, or delta t.
And I imagine it would change. It would probably change between different like species too, right? Like very small things, I think, probably experience time faster, I would assume. But I don't actually know if that's true.
But also, so, sorry, Renzo, yeah?
No, I was just going to say that, I mean, the difference we're looking for here is just the difference that makes two subjective present conscious, right? But I was thinking, like, in general, you could actually like think like to whom differences at different time scales would make a difference. So I was reading this thing, like this essay on like Causal, and he distinguishes like time scale, like this time scale of like struggle and like social struggle from the time scale of loss, and they have like two different time scales, right? So like loss take longer to be made and stuff. So you could say something like the difference from the point of view of the state in which like loss make a difference. They, from this system perspective, from the state, these are the differences, the time scale that is like effective for it, right? And from the point of view of like people who are actually like doing like the struggle, which is a faster time scale, these differences don't make a difference to them. So it looks like just like, so it's important to always like look at to which system and to which perspective these differences are making the difference. So in this case, we're always like searching for the border and the border of experience, of present experience, right? Of actual passage of subjective experience.
I think also this is important because, I mean, I think it's important to frame the novelty of this in the right way, also to know how to, what makes it interesting for other things, because though the more, I mean, a bunch of very classical questions come to mind about the neural correlates and how to correlate these things and what does this mean and so on and so forth. I think that it's almost more interesting to be kind of cautious with kind of too eagerly going to a sort of experimental view, because there is already a very novel idea in this idea of, you know, trying to find a sort of emergence of a intrinsic consistency of consciousness from a sort of deregulated or unspecified relation between parts and wholes, rather than a localized version or a functional version, because both the distributed view of how the neuronal correlates relate to consciousness and the localist version, none of them have this plasticity of saying, perhaps, you know, the correlation between these nodes, like the structure of these nodes, it constrains a certain space of relations, which has an intrinsic consistency. But you can imagine a part of this system making a difference on a longer scale of time, as well as a short one. And for some for some more instantaneous phenomena, this makes a difference in this way, and this same thing plays a different part if you consider how it makes a difference for a, you know, even broader space or a different scale of, like, I think that the very fact that we are moving from that we are moving towards this causal structure idea, right, where there is a continuous discussion from connections, constraints, and the forming of a consistent plane that exists at an irreducible level, right? You don't have to introduce any qualitative difference. You don't have to introduce any, let's say, jump from saying that there is some magical substance or that there is some special phenomena to be able to move from analyzing nodes, how they connect, and if a consistency that's irreducible to the elementary connections appears, like that's translucent, right? There's nothing hidden there. That seems already like where the big jump is, in opposition to, let's say, I mean, it might even be the case that, you know, the sort of experiments that might lead, like the sort of truly novel experiments that might follow from this might be quite counterintuitive as well, right? Because it's also kind of clear that it's almost too plastic, almost too complex at the same time for you to just reconstruct brain activity in this way from the ground up, right? So it just seems to me like for our perspective, when we're talking about, okay, how do you move from local to global? How do you discuss the social coordination and complexity and things like this? It seems that the essential insight that makes this very, very relatable and like to shed a different light on this is that it shows very clearly that it is the effectivity or on the production of difference that is actually establishing what is the right scale to analyze, which subsystems are relevant and which are not, right? Rather than the inverse, like we identify the relevant stuff in the brain and then we build from that, right? I feel like that's the main place where something different comes. Like this already implies a sort of different analogy to social systems, right? To approach social systems from that same perspective already brings a new light, I think. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense though, but
from what I gathered from what you said, it's like approaching it from the phenomenon first, like from the rather than, because we are using the brain as the privileged example, and I think the brain comes with a lot of prior knowledge of, for example, the time scales and so on, like what is the right thing to be measuring. But if we were to expand this to non-brains that have consciousness, I think it seems to be more fruitful to start from what phenomena is there to register in the first place, and then work backwards to determine the type of integrated information that, or what the structure of that information is. Again, going back to the economy example, like what are the phenomena that appear in an economy, and therefore what must be receptive to that type of appearance? I don't know. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I'm just trying to kind of not summarize, but kind of find the right angle at which to see what's novel about all of this, that makes it not something that is, let's say, waiting for the right confirmation from some experiments to prove its validity for neuroscience, but from the fact that it's already a novel way to relate some elements, right? It's already a novel way to think, to approach, let's say, the consistency of something which nobody knows how to relate it to, let's say, its material basis, right? So at that point, it has an underlying problem that is similar to problems that we are interested in other fields. Like, you don't want to reduce the consistency of some systems, or the consistency, or the sort of intrinsic coherence of a system, just to the stuff that supports it. And in that sense, it also sounds a lot like the end of the atomic logic in Logics of Worlds, because the whole point of how do you revert, how appearances change, or how if appearances appear in a certain way, what does that say about the multiple that supports it, right? That's also there in a way. But it seems like this is the first point, right? It's a different strategy to deal with that kind of hard problem of material support that lacks a quality that you find in the intrinsic coherence of a certain phenomena. And it has this, at that point already, it makes a new strategy, which is to privilege the axiomatization of the phenomena themselves, right? But then there is a second thing, which I think it's amazing, which is to say, now when you look through the postulates and you try to think about what is a physical substrate that can instantiate the properties of these axioms, you're not looking for qualities, you're looking for forms of organization, properties of an organization, not properties of stuff. Of course, the properties of stuff are going to allow for some organizations or not, but the causal structure is a sort of let's say it's a constraint on the relations of this Markov chain stuff, right? Of t-1, t, and t+1. That's what we're calling a difference, right? That's where differences are being kind of grasped. So that seems like a second big point, which is you're not so much looking at, like, it's a different way of choosing what to look at, I think, which leads to that crazy counterintuitive result of, totally inactive structure is structured nonetheless, right? It's not the equivalent to something that has been deactivated or it's unstructured, right? So that seems to me like the second very novel thing, which is to say, let's not look for differences in the actual substrate, but on the organization of the substrate, right? That's what will define what counts as a difference and what doesn't. Like that seems also part of what's novel about the strategy, I think, and what makes it also amenable to this particular formal treatment with the TPMs and all that, right? So yeah, I don't know. I'm just saying this because I get lost. I mean, there's so much stuff that sometimes I get lost on what to focus on, you know?
Yeah, because one way to think of this is a way of expressing this, a definition of structure, which is a collection of TPMs that are glued together by different purviews, selections of purviews, right? I think that's the term.
Mm-hmm.
And then for your choice of purviews, you have a set of TPMs that are consistent among each other in some way. Like there must be maps between one TPM to another. So, I mean, I have to go to saying this, but it's basically a sheaf of TPMs.
Yeah,
Right?
can you go over what the purviews are?
Yeah. So let me see where I explain the purviews. Okay, so this is the TPM. So the TPM can refer to either like the full TPM, which would describe like the full rule of evolution of the system, or to like subsets of this thing. And let me show you what the cause purview is. Yeah, here. Okay, so the purviews are the units over which a certain mechanism has an effect and a cause. So, I mean, so basically the space of over which I like have produce effects. But this space, like I could be connected to many things, but there are some things that I make like some really weak effects that shouldn't be counted. But there's a subset of this space of purviews of things that I'm connected to and then produce effects in which is optimal to be maximally like effective. So the purview is just like the selection of units over which I'm making effects and receiving causes.
So it's like the subset you're looking at after like the perturbation, right? Like what you're measuring.
Yeah, like it's the next, the immediate next state and the previous state. So you have like a mechanism in a state, which is like the current state of the thing, and then you have a potential space. The purview just is the units over which in the future you're producing your effects and the units in the past over which you're receiving causes.
Dennis, are you saying that the sheaf is like the, I guess like the purview along with the effects or the causal structure?
Yeah. So, right. I'm saying that, yeah, the purviews are like slices of the space, and you're excluding all the purviews that don't contribute as much, right? You're basically choosing a set of purviews. By choosing a set of purviews, you're basically choosing a topology for your system, right? Yep. Because at least I think, right? I think you're choosing a topology because I think you're including all intersections and unions of every purview you choose. And then so now that you have a topology, what is the data you assign to each purview? You're assigning a trend TPM.
Not really a TPM, but I mean, it depends on, it gets a little bit tricky because on the version, on 3.0, the effect purview is a distribution, right? It's an effect repertoire. So it's a certain distribution. It's the distribution over the states of the purview. So the causal distinction here would be a certain mechanism, which is a certain like subset of the whole system, a certain purview, and the purview has its own like effect repertoire defined by these constraints between mechanism in a state and effect purview. In the 4.0, I mean, it's kind of technical, but the effect purview, it's not a distribution, it becomes a certain state. Like it's as if the mechanism chooses a certain state at which also the state of the purview. So it's not only I know over which units I have effects, but also which state I am betting it that the purview is. So, and this is due to like this intrinsic distance, which is, but in any case, I don't know if like maybe you're talking about also about relations, which is the way in which different distinctions are related by producing effects like that are like consistent between them. So you have a relation in IIT if given two mechanisms, given two like distinctions, their effect purviews agree on the units and agree on the states. So you could have like, and that's where the space paper explain like these new things, which is really interesting, but really like tricky and hard to understand because it's the overlaps. Basically, it's the relations in IT is about overlaps between purviews, but you could have overlaps between effects and effects, between cause and effects, between effects and causes, and between causes and causes. Well, maybe it's more related to the way you glue like different distinctions according to whether they like agree on what they from their perspective think is going on. So the relations measure this kind of like agreement between like this mutual consistency and irreducible consistency between causal distinctions. I don't know if it's helping.
Yeah, no, I see. It seems like it's like matching up, I guess, not to get too technical, but it's like it's matching up sheaves into like opposite categories, right? Because they go in opposite directions, the causes and effects.
Yeah, I don't know. The only thing like
anyways
important to keep in mind is that the distinctions are what are like the part, like the real parts of a system, and the relations is the way things are binded. But distinctions are the equivalent to part, like irreducible parts for that system. And then a system is made out of, a conceptual structure is basically distinctions with their own like effect and cause purview and relations. Each of which have its own amount of irreducibility, which is measured by small phi. And then big phi is the system's overall irreducibility. So it's not, the big phi is measuring how much the system as a whole exists, and the small phi is measuring how much each part inside of the whole exists. And
small phis are organs and big phis is the body.
Yeah. Is there, how do you express the relation between the small phis and the big phi? Like, I mean, are there functions that?
I mean, in 3.0, it was a certain way, and in 4.0, it's a crazy new formula, which I'm not even aware of. I mean, it's not out. Yeah. But I think big phi is, I mean, it's hard to interpret what exactly. I mean, it has a function which is to pick out which system is existing as a whole. So it plays a super big role here, if you remember. Yeah, I have this. which is like selecting which you have to choose where big phi is maximal, choose which of the systems exist. So it excludes out of existence the subsets and supersets which have lower phi. So I mean, God doesn't exist because he would have like super big phi and he would like exclude all its subsets. And I mean, there's like a corollary of the exclusion principle in a sense. Like yeah, but I mean, just to say that this big phi is measuring like the wholeness of a system and small phi is measuring the irreducibility of a part within that whole.
Yeah, it really meant that I'm not joking, like with the organ definition and the body definition in logics of world, it really seems similar, right? Because the organ is
in Badiou, you mean?
Yeah, the maximally existing, he doesn't use a causal language, right? But it's the maximally existing apparent such that it follows from it a certain connection, right? What he calls this point, being positively defined, right? Whereas the body is the envelope of this smaller maximally existing subparts. So I don't know, it seems very close to me, though the language is totally different. Like this is also part of the thing that I'm interested in, because one of the things that Badiou tries to introduce in his treatment of constructing, because his theory of a body, like he has two theories of consistency, right? The theory of a world, which is this sort of coherence of a certain operational space, and then he has this theory of how some other coherence can emerge inside of this, right? And it actually has many of the elements we're talking about. Like it has this idea of perturbations that might lead to some effect or not, right? Which kind of sounds a bit like the whole point theory of filtering some unknown space through this Boolean transcendental that will give you either it connects or it doesn't. And then you get two measures of that connectivity, right? The body connectivity, so the body would be the set of all ways that values in that world become responsive to that perturbation, to that event, right? To that eventual trace, as he calls it. But not always do you, like for not all perturbations or for not all effects, the only reference to the question, what caused this, is this global coherence. You can have, let's say, a more local coherent principle. So for example, the example that he gives, like an army, right? An army constructs a localized coherent space that produces effects. It treats the world, it changes something, right? But not all questions get the answer, like who did this? You don't need to answer always the army. Either it's a regularity of the world, this is what follows from by merely letting things be, or there was an agent that made something singularly. So the army did this change. You can also have answers of the form, the soldiers did something, right? So there is an inner structure to this body that divides, let's say, localized ways of kind of evaluating a change that is dependent on that body. So it's caused by that body. The effect implies a previous state where the body was the one that caused it, but not always the answer needs to be so global. It can have a local answer. For example, in that army, soldier, army, infantry, or I don't know what are the parts of an army these days, but the drones, I guess. So you get that inner distinction, right, between two levels of analysis that are correlated but not totally reducible to one another of causal power, right, of having a capacity. So I don't know, it seems to kind of mirror some of the stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, I guess I'm wondering what is the, I see the relation you're talking about with organs and how they kind of have this autonomous aspect to them. And then I'm just wondering what is the right mechanism for gluing these back together?
Right, because I mean, that's why I think when you said sheaves, that's why it reminded me, because a condition for there to be a body is that the treatment of local points are compatible between one another, right? So they allow for a real synthesis. So for you to create a difference that you can refer back to an intrinsic organization and not simply to, let's say, general interventions of the world, right? I mean, to move away from the brain, but to find a similar problem, like people take on the streets and a regime is toppled. You can, if you are a reductionist, you will say, those people didn't do anything. They're not the subject of any action. This is just what happens when the economy goes bad. People go to the street. So the actual difference is the economy. Politics was just the means, and the transformation is actually related back to the economy, not to that political organization. It's not the singular, it's not the cause. It didn't make a difference. It's just the epiphenomenical presentation of economic crisis. There was an economic crisis. This leads people to go to the streets, and then the government was toppled, but it's not really due to that action, right? So that's, let's say, that's putting all the capacity for change on the side of the world. Well, when economies go bad, governments go down, right? But then you actually, what we're looking for with logics of worlds is a formal machinery to allow us to rationally uphold that organizations, meaning local constructions with stuff that exist in the world, can have capacities that the world doesn't have. So for example, that world could go into economic crisis and nothing would happen. Only because such an organization was there the capacity to topple the government, right? That's the underlying problem that Logics of Worlds wants to deal with. For many fields, like given the world of figurative painting, you could have a madman doing some crazy abstract stuff, and it wouldn't be art. You needed the construction of a certain experimental organization of works so that it acquires a capacity that the world of figurative painting didn't have. It's not reducible back to mere, let's say, unfolding of that world. So there is some causal emergence in that sense, right? That's why the whole book is about capacity in a certain sense, like the book from the middle forward, right? After he constructed what a world is, now he wants to come up with something that emerges with a capacity that wasn't there before. And his whole point seems to be that for you to be able to claim that a political organization, movement, or manifestation did something, meaning that the causal power is related to the intrinsic existence of that organization and not simply kind of is indistinguishable if it is from intrinsically or just, you know, structural in this broader sense, a worldly phenomena, right? To be able to have a singular causal power, he gives two combined conditions. One concerns difference, which is that theory of points, right? And the other concerns compatibility and synthesis, right? Which is, I think, what you guys were talking about, the sheaves issue. Like, it's not enough that you can treat a point, meaning that an organization is able to produce an effect which depends on it existing, right? Like, you can only, let's say, the difference that it makes a difference in the world, right? The difference that it is. Like, you also need that these points, these differences, be compatible between themselves. So they need to have an internal coherence, right? So that's the part that I think comes close to what you were talking about. It's not enough to have a certain purview of effects where you can see that something was changed in T0 and then T1 was changed, but you need this effects to have some relation between them, right? To guarantee that they belong to a space or something like this.
Yeah. Because I was thinking about the situation where, reading that calculating phi slides, at the end it's talking about the Earth mover distance, right? Is that and it uses this to be the metric for phi.
Yeah.
And there's this notion of the null concept, which is basically the unconstrained case where there's no or is an empty cause effect repertoire. So it doesn't, you haven't like chosen any, maybe any purview, or you're just kind of looking at the raw TPM, right? I don't know if that's the right terminology, but, and then the Earth mover distance calculates the distance from the null concept to all these different concepts or mechanisms, which are different constraints, right? And then that total distance from the null concept to all these different, meaning that there's some kind of non-trivial thing, right? Because if there can be organizations that are very big but have a very low phi because their individual organs, their organs can actually be calculated quite trivially from the whole. But it's only when you have a body whose organs cannot simply be derived from the whole, that's when you have a high degree of phi. I don't know. I don't know if that's my intuition right now of the Earth mover's distance, right? The Earth mover distance seems to calculate how non-trivial is this space, like how far away are these individual constraints from the unconstrained system, which is just the total TPM.
You're talking that about big phi, right? The way
the relation between big phi and a little phi.
I vaguely remember. So it was
Because you could think of it as like every time you make a cut to the system, let's say you have A, B, C, every time you make a cut, there can be a case where it's very trivial in the sense that
for example, I think
it doesn't behave any difference.
Yeah, like for example, you have parties in Brazil, like communist parties, it tend to be like that, right? You can remove basically the whole base of the party and their effectivity remains the same. Like the inner connections between most people in the party don't contribute at all to the difference that the party makes, right? And that you can have I mean, I think in Brazil, the Workers' Party perhaps can be analyzed in this way because it probably is bigger today, perhaps, than it was in the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. But it's likely that it had a higher degree of intrinsic complexity, the way that unions and the base and workers and all of this stuff was integrated. If you cut some of this out, you would lose a big part of the party. Whereas today, the amount of people who are actually part of it doesn't really play that big a role as before, even though it might be larger.
Yeah, exactly. How, I don't even know the right term, but how the degree to which you can't make cuts without drastically altering the outcome or the causal structure, right? That seems to be somehow related to the sheaf idea, right? Because like a topological space is one where you can have trivial and non-trivial cuts, right, in a space. You can draw circles in a space that can be shrunk down to a point, and so in that sense, that circle is kind of trivial. But then you can draw circles in the space which cannot be shrunk down, right, because they're a border. They're a border of a hole in the space, and yeah, I'm thinking of that as similar to these cuts in when you calculate the minimum information partition. It seems relevant or related to this notion of like drawing circles in a space and then seeing which ones shrink to a point and which ones.
Yeah, I mean, again, yeah, it makes perfect sense to me because again, in Badiou's whole issue, right? The whole point is that you always get this double treatment to be able to show the dependency of some effects on the existence of a new organization, for example. So, what he calls treatment of points, right? To produce statements of the form, if this is true, if this hypothesis or this political declaration is true, then this exists, or this condition follows, or this effect exists, right? To do this is the same as to build a topology, right? Like the conditions that he imposes on this process of treating points, those conditions also imply that the set of points forms a topology.
Yeah,
exactly. This is also related between the connection between topology and logic, which I hope to go into next week. But it's like you can think of like the sets in the topology is like the places where a certain predicate applies, right? Mm-hmm. And that predicate applies like as you go up. So then you can get like from the physical structure of the space, you can get like a logical structure as well between like how predicates of different parts relate to one another.
Exactly, yeah. And I think you guys are right that the points are in Badiou, that's how constraints are passed along.
Yeah.
For every point you treat in Badiou's system means, what does it mean to treat it? It means to close off certain outcomes and open up other outcomes, right?
Yeah, because what I'm trying to get at is that I think that what Renzo is presenting is a much more hands-on and localized interpretation of a very broad principle that in Logics of Worlds is presented in the most abstract formula possible, which is the relation between dependence of effects, right? Which is what we're talking about with the transition probability matrices. They are defining values of dependence, right? If this happens, this has some probability of happening. Let's say that the dependence of this on that exists very much, or exists half, or exists nothing, right? So Badiou gives a very broad view of this when he talks about, look, treating a bunch of points and kind of passing on the constraints, right? If this equality principle allows you to kind of make a difference of a certain form, right? Let's say there is this initial perturbation or this initial trait that says certain equality is possible. Well, this allows you to create an implicative structure where if this is true, then it follows that those two people that are on separate sides of the struggle can be on the same side, right? Can be on both parts of this organization. That's a non-trivial consequence because from the standpoint of the world, that wouldn't follow, right? That irreducible to the world, that effect. That effect is only possible because of that inner intrinsic structure of that organization. So you have this sort of, on the one side, a theory of how to treat the world from the standpoint of an organization, a new organization, is to kind of collect everything that depends on that organization, right? The space of what it constrains, non-trivially, right? Because of course, in the world, it was already impossible to, I don't know, everyone to live their lives without work. That was impossible. It remains impossible. It remains out of the way of that organization. It's not going to make that possible, but it might make some other stuff possible that was previously impossible to entail, right? So on the one hand, you get this kind of space of possible entailments that don't need to be all maximal, right? And even the things that you don't entail are also relevant in terms of information for him. But this gives rise to a spatial approach as well, right? You can treat this the same approach that treats these dependence levels is also constructing an interior, right? You are able to say, that's why he calls it a body. Like, this is not just a kind of vague differentiation process. It is a kind of an individuation process, because you're increasingly capable of saying there is an inside and an outside to this, right? The things that don't connect and the things that do connect, the things that are non-trivially imply the existence of this organization, and the things that don't give a shit, right? It's incapable of affecting. But that's a very broad view of this. It doesn't really give you means to talk about information and causation very clearly, or to do it in a way that is more cogent to discussions of complexity and things like this. And I think that what Renzo is showing is something that fits the general umbrella, you know, but with the formal language is already much closer to even an economics discussion, right? Because of clarifying issues concerning complexity and information and so on. But I'm not sure if you guys think that this broad move makes sense, you know, from that discussion of points, organs, and bodies and inner consistency, and this discussion that we're having with IIT.
It makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think I need to review the exact way in which the phi is being calculated, but I think, yeah, in general, it makes sense that we have this move from Badiou's general framework to a causal system, right? Because Badiou doesn't deal with causal systems. It's at a different level in which appearances are different. Appearances are different from each other, but they don't, unless you maybe think about the dependence operator as being a causal operator. Maybe there's something we can do there.
Yeah, I think you can think of it that way, like in the where he talks about like hating algebras and stuff, in like the implication has to do with like one thing being less than or equal to the other. There's another condition I forget, but it has to do with like the partial order is the implication thing. So I think you could translate that to like a temporal causation.
Mm-hmm.
And then like in that way, the past state is a subset, a certain type of subset of the future state or the current present state.
Yeah. So there's
I think
some mapping. Yeah, some way to map what Badiou's doing to this, but we have to now consider probability distributions rather than values on a hiding algebra, which aren't ordered, and or I mean they're ordered, but they're partially ordered So it's kind of, I don't know if there's a mathematics of probability over hiding algebras, but see, that would probably be very hard to think about. But now you have this like probability spaces and then these, yeah, I feel like the transition matrix really makes it easier to understand what is happening between two times. And then, like you said, Renzo, the thing about it's not actually assigning transition matrices to every concept. It's actually assigning distributions.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me see. Yeah. The problem is that there are like changes from 3.0 to 4.0, which are not published yet. But
okay.
Yeah, but there's this idea in IIT that in the end, so you start with something that you think it's real, which is like the system and in a state, the mechanism in a state. That's what you start like from the beginning. It looks like it's more like actual and more like concrete, which is like a certain like network, you know. And then you start to like based on the TPM, which gives you the transitions to future and past states. You start to like construct all these irreducible elements which are about potentiality, right? It's not something that has already happened or will happen. It's just about constraint. But in the end, what actually exists for IIT is the cause effect structure, which is this kind of like network of potentialities. So what's actually actual is I think maybe on Julio's book, he actually says that potentiality is actuality in the end, because what really is real is the cause effect structure. And maybe one, I don't know if it will add to confusion or actually clarify between potentiality and actuality, is that, I mean, one way to see is that like IIT is a theory about irreducible causation, but irreducible causation in the sense of this potentiality, like how a certain state, a certain situation, if you unfold its mechanisms, you get like this kind of like really complex potentiality space, which is actually what is identical to experience. So what actually appears subjectively is this space of potential, this potential space of real constraints. On the other hand, there is like this kind of spin-off theory of, I just like, it's like a kind of a spin-off theory of actual causation. And it's based on like the same math and the same like principles, but it's not concerned with what a system in a state does. It's actually concerned with what actually happened. So you're in actual causation, which is, it's actually a nice paper because it tries to give its own account of causality as normally understood in philosophy. Like you have a certain cause, a certain effect, something happened, and you ask what's the cause of that stuff that happened, which is not what IIT is concerned, right? IIT is concerned about this space of potential constraints that generates this kind of inner consistency in which the system appears to itself because of this irreducible way in which this potential constraint. Actual causation is about given certain transition happened, like you actually observe that was from the, this is more extrinsic and IT is more intrinsic, but actual causation looks as a certain transition between that actually occurred from one state to the other, you observed it, and then you try to come up with this causal account of which were the causes and which were the effects. So you have like a lot of literature trying to solve these problems of like, say, I cannot like come up right now, but you have like many of these examples of like preemption in which like someone was going to poison you, but then someone intervened and changed the poison for water and then you didn't die. So who caused you surviving? Like the person who changed the water? Or I mean, there are like many scenarios in which you try to come up with the account, but it's kind of like more extrinsic. And you have this theory in which you actually, and it's really cool. I mean, you try to come up with the causal count of causes which are more like real. It's hard to say exactly what, because it's not intrinsic, but I mean it's cool. So I mean, in this case, it would try to it computes the irreducible causes and effects similar to IIT, but it's actually trying to explain what happened. So I mean, just to give like a cool brief example. I'm just showing this because there's like a cool GIF in the end. So you have like these animats, which I think it might be like a cool way to think about organizations like evolving in a kind of ecosystem, and so these animats, which is basically this Markov animats. It's called like, it has a name with Markov in the middle. It evolves in this kind of like natural environment in which it has like a genome, and it just genome codes for a TPM, and this is a representation of the brain of the animal, and it gets kind of like selected based on its fitness in this game it's playing. So it learns how to, so the game is actually this, it catches, it has a task in which it has to catch and a small block and avoid another block. And it has a harder task, and it has two sensors. So it lives in this world, which is, so it's this guy down here, and he has two sensors which can see like right above him, like the column above. The sensor gets activated if there's something on top. And so it has these two sensors which process like these two columns in the world, and he has like two motor units which can go right or left. And then you like simulate, like we simulated in this environment in which the fit ones are selected, and then they mutate, and then they breed, and then in the end you get these really fit creatures which integrate information. That's what's interesting. Like, and then you get like harder tasks in which it has like to catch a small one and avoid a bigger one, and it gets really tricky how he could solve this task, because he can only see like two non-contiguous like things. But and so I mean it's cool to see how like a certain animat learns a certain, what you say, like a representation of the world in its intrinsic causal distinctions. So it evolves to create its own causal distinctions, and it happens that in really like hard tasks, it tends to integrate more information because it uses the same node to like code higher order distinctions and do more stuff with that. So it can do more with less. Like instead of coming up with like a feed-forward solution of that, which would take like more nodes and more like wiring, you could actually like use the same node for different tasks, and then you end up integrating information. So it's like an evolutionary explanation for that. So, and then with this actual causation, you can actually like ask why the animat went right rather than left in like this kind of, so you extrinsic point of view. So you compute this formalism which comes up with causes and effect, and like what so you come up like with all these architectures that solve the test, and it's kind of like cool is that we try to like come up with measures based on this causal account of what happened. And so this is like you ask for the causes of like why did at a given time point a certain mod he went to the right, and then you try to backtrack the causes. So you given a certain like movement to the right, you ask what caused it. Maybe the C node, an inner node, and or maybe the sensor, it just moved because a certain sensor came lighted up. And then you ask for the cause of that, and then we try to show that it evolved like inner causes more than sensorial causes. So we try to show that if you backtrack the causes, most causes came from within rather than directly from the sensors. So that would be a way to argue that autonomy and agency evolves as these causes are backtracked to inner structure rather directly to sensory. So instead of being a reflexive being that just gets sensors, reads the sensors and do stuff, it has this chain of causality that so what the way that we kind of argue is that agency in some sense would be related to this kind of reverberating chains of causes that gets caught up inside the animal. So something like that. So when you are learning to ride a bicycle, there's a lot of ongoing stuff inside you, trying to figure out what exactly you have to do. So there's a lot of inner autonomous agency, and but once you learn, it becomes pretty much fit for hardwired, right? You just see something and react, and you just ride a bicycle. So it would be a way to come up with.
So it's a way of saying that that this is, it's not that the little creature is, if there is some input, it will have some output, but most of the causal information comes from that intrinsic view then.
Yeah, exactly. So the long story would be to show that, I mean, it's a really far shot to say, I think, but to say that these causes come from the complex, the conscious complex, rather than directly from the sensors. So and that's why you feel you're doing something, because it's, I mean, but I showed this also to say that there's this extrinsic causal account of actual transitions but that's not actually what the system from its intrinsic point of view could what existed for the system itself. I don't know if
there's this distinction also in Lacan's logical time, because he has this sophism and then this reasoning of the prisoners, but then there's the intrinsic view, which is full of anxiety and full of this drama, and then there's an external view, which is when you see two people with white discs on them, then you must be white, something like that, right? There's a reduction, a subjective reduction into just a rule, right? I mean, that's how I'm reading what you're saying, that you can take any backtracking process and turn it into a feed forward, but if you just I don't know, once you've set a cutoff, right, at some point it's no longer useful to backtrack, and then at that point you can just create a rule to follow in the future.
Yeah,
I don't know if that's
I think it's related in some sense to this other major implication. The theory is that feed-forward systems don't exist for themselves, because they don't have both causes and effects. They don't have having intrinsic causes and effect, because you just have feed-forward causation. You don't have intrinsic causation. So there's this theorem there's this famous theory in which you can basically compute any function using a feed-forward system. So given anything that a recurrent metric could do, you could find a new mapping of connections, which will be more it would take more nodes and you need more stuff to do it, but you can actually reobtain the same input-output behavior for anything using a feed-forward architecture.
Yeah, it's an arbitrary function estimator, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's like not, it has certain like biases still like put in. That's like only like given if you have infinite nodes,
right.
infinite constraints basically. So it's like not always very helpful.
Yeah. So I mean, maybe either you approximate like a finite number of states, or you need like an infinite amount of like stuff to approximate the full. But I mean, yeah, you could like, but I mean, this gives up like a lot of this discussion between functionalists and IIT, like intrinsic causation guys, because these would be used to argue that IIT is unfalsifiable. It's called like the unfolding argument. And there's a lot of discussion on that, saying that because IIT can, like, you cannot, how's the argument again? I mean, you can always find like a functional equivalent that doesn't integrate information. You cannot like, an IIT will say that one is conscious and the other is not, and you cannot find like an experiment that could distinguish that, then IIT is unfalsifiable. So, I mean, but the thing is that for IIT, this feed-forward thing doesn't exist for itself. That there's no way it could appear, it cannot like feel there's something there is like to be this system, because there's no intrinsic, there's no way there's an intrinsic point of view to that, like an irreducible intrinsic maximal point of view. So intrinsic organization matters for appearance for IT, while for like functionalists, like global workspace, it doesn't matter. Like,
yeah, sorry.
No, I was just going to talk a little bit about global workspace, just to show like the contrastive way that normal things are normally like explained. If you want to say something.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, because I mean, I think you made a really good point about how crucial the distinction between activity and disposition is. And then it seems like this other opposition is very crucial as well, right? Extrinsic versus intrinsic, right? It seems like that critique of, well, it's unfalsifiable because if I can always come up with a feed-forward system that has the same input and the same output as this intrinsic one, but that seems like a weird argument, because being intrinsic here is not a means to an end. It is part of the end itself, right? It is a property of what we're trying to come up with, right? That it is intrinsic. So, but I remember from the IIT 3.0 paper that it has this distinction between, it says this integrated system implies reflexivity, right, or some sort of feedback loop, but that's a necessary but not sufficient condition, right? Because you can have kind of feedback systems that have no irreducibility, right? Their level of phi is very, very low, right?
You said that what the recurrency is not a necessary, is it necessary but not sufficient condition?
Yeah, right. I mean.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. But I think the kind of, it's this argument that IIT makes in the 3.0 is like a really fast argument. Why it like, and this is crucial for IIT. Like, I don't know at which, I don't remember when, but when it uses, it says that you need both like irreducible causes and effects, right? So you cannot have like nodes that just receive, that are caused by things. It has to also produce effects, and it's not enough to just like produce effects in the system. You also have to be caused by it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what eliminates like feed-forward systems for being conscious. But it's a tricky argument, like, and it's not written most.
Yeah, the part I remember, is that part here: self-generated, self-referential, and holistic, right? So you would need these three properties to have something which is integrated and has an intrinsic view, right? In opposition with the zombie version.
Oh no, it's another one.
Yeah, I don't know what you might think about this idea, but you know, the generative adversarial networks, the ones where you have like a discriminator and a, I don't know, like a faking thing, right? So something that tries to fool the discriminator, and then it produces a rule basically that we could unroll it into a feed-forward network, but the fact that it kind of communicates with itself in that way is kind of a novel thing, right? That it, like, behaviorally, yes, everything is just a function. So, I mean, it's kind of not interesting in that sense, but internally you can create these different, like, conceptually different parts of the system that in their interplay or their relation with each other, as we've been saying, we can produce different behaviors.
It's also in that situation, it's kind of like almost like a competition between the two, right? So it's like constraints that are produced by that are such that it makes like the one that's trying to fool the discriminator, the generator, like as good as possible, right?
Yeah,
so it's
exactly.
an example of the same thing with the constraints.
Yeah, like you want to, let's say, distinguish a face. You want to find out what a face, who this face belongs to or something. Then you generate a face and then you try to distinguish that face. Is that face real or not?
Yeah, I mean, what it's really, I don't know if they're used for like discrimination between like object, like face recognition, but they're used for like generation, right? So have you seen those like NVIDIA like deep fake faces?
Oh yeah, exactly.
They've gotten so good now. But yeah, they're used with GANs.
Yeah. So you want to make a really lifelike, something that can fool us, right? Then you need to create something, and then the discriminator will say, "Oh, well, I can tell the difference, so try better, try something else," and then you kind of optimize. You have two different optimization things happening. I don't know. That seems to have like a cause-effect structure there.
But man, you were going to say something about the global workspace theory.
Oh yeah, true. Where is the slide?
I think you just passed it.
Not here. Yeah, just to like, it's also maybe worth like some reading, like the alternative like explanations of. I mean, I won't do like justice to like the real like rival theory. So, because I mean, it has been a long time since I studied. So, but basically global workspace has this idea, and it's basically the biggest alternative candidate for like a theory of consciousness, and it's has been proposed by, it's not only advocated by Dehaene, which is a French guy, but he basically says that there's this consciousness is the global broadcast of information. It's this capacity of a system to widely like dispose, make accessible a certain stimuli or a certain representation to the rest of the system. So it's explained like that. So something only, a perceptual content only becomes conscious when there's a widely broadcasted when they are widely broadcasted to other processors across the brain. So it must be available, and this availability is normally like read as some form of like cognitive access, like you can use it for manipulating, for like working memory to like do something, like certain calculation, like extract some information to do something. It's accessible in this way. So, and it also has this idea of ignition, in which like you have like some local sensorial like processes that get processed in like the primary cortices, but you need this kind of ignition in which these local events get broadcasted to the whole global workspace, and it gets conscious, it becomes conscious somehow. So I mean, but the main problem here is, like I said, is that it's really extrinsic, like it's as if the signal that gets broadcasted, it has a label that is written like color or like face, or and this global workspace is able to like interpret it somehow. So it won't explain like why a certain system that is ignited and reaches global availability means that, like how does the global workspace knows that signal means that it is like a face or it is like a tiger, right? Because it just specifies that there is this, it has to be available, and that's it. Now it's conscious. So it crosses this threshold and makes into this arena of like being transmittable, and it's really like consciousness becomes really a function, right? It's about being this capacity for disposing if to do stuff, but it's not an explanation.
What does the threshold of availability mean? Like what does it mean by making certain like localizations available? Like I guess mean exactly.
I really, they don't really explain it. I mean, that's the problem. It's really, it's like you just get like some of these drawings, like there's some recurrence somehow. Like you get like some rearrangement and feed forward between like parietal and frontal cortices, and somehow it feels like something. Yeah. I mean, in terms of mechanism, it's really plausible. I mean, there's evidence, and they dispute whether, basically whether for IIT, like this perceptual appearance is located in the back, like in the parietal cortex. Conscious is more local, while for a global workspace, you need this kind of like frontal to parietal, like reentrant, like broadcasting process, in which the frontal cortices is able to, because like frontal cortices are normally like responsible for like executive processes like attention and control and planning and manipulating information. So the idea is that there needs to be something like more operational rather than just like constituting like this intrinsic point of view that might as well not do anything. So it's they don't I mean it's like a cognitive theory. It's just like has drawings and proposes like neurobiological mechanisms, but it won't explain like why exactly these processes leads to conscious.
Yeah, sure. It feels like something, I'm not really grasping it, but it feels like something that almost like modern like neural networks already have, right? Like artificial neural networks. If you're just like defining it just based on like access to information, and like, I don't know, it seems like a weak definition is I guess. Maybe I'm just not understanding it though.
Yeah, I mean, it gives like a plausible neurobiological mechanism, but not like any sort of like relationship between the structure of experience and a certain structure of information processing.
Yeah.
It's weird also because it seems to define consciousness as something that, I mean, it's not I think that this is a really good distinction because it seems to imply a classic idea of appearance where things appear to something, whereas, so there is a kind of idea of making accessible to, right? To make accessible to consciousness or something like this, right? Broadcasting already seems to imply like where it comes from, where it goes, whereas the way we've been discussing, it seems a more contemporary idea of phenomenology where it's the space of appearance is the thing to be explained, not who it appears to or where it appears to, right?
Yeah.
I think
It
that's
already presupposes like who is receiving the message and able to interpret, and this kind of like space is already like this global workspace is already a given, and how do you understand the message? Like, so yeah, all this structure that you actually need to explain is already kind of given, and then you just observe things happening and coming to appearance and just going away. And
yeah, it sounds almost like it's a functionalist, like saying consciousness is a sort of theater where you access things, and therefore we should look for something which has a sort of broadcast structure, because that's what consciousness does, right? So it seems like it starts from our functional phenomenology. Consciousness is about making things accessible, being aware, right? So it has a more kind of functional subject-object idea, and then looks for something like that. Whereas IIT seems to approach consciousness as a sort of sort of qualitatively specific sort of space, right? The axioms, they don't imply a subject, for example, they imply simply like internal coherence, right? It's not really who or what appears so much as what it means to appear, right? Some rules of appearance. It seems like a very different starting point.
yeah, and experimentally this appears as this big debate whether consciousness is different from attention. So if you can show that you're only conscious of what you attend to, then you can explain it as an attentional process in which is attention is, so being appearing is just noting that it appeared, right? So you instead of explaining appearance, you explain noticing something appeared.
Yeah, it seems like a different idea.
Yeah.
Also, I mean, I'm trying to, like, I know everything is very wild and naive in a certain sense, but I mean, I'm always trying to go back to this kind of triadic exercise, right? There is a sort of underlying issue of, okay, what tools do we have to reconceive large-scale social systems in a way that we can talk about them, for example, capitalist social system as one amongst others, and to talk about organizations or social political projects as being made of the same stuff as the thing you're trying to intervene on. And then we move from this problem to this hypothesis that Badiou has some formal tools that go in that direction, but they're very broad. They're not tuned to what we're interested in. And then the third part seems to be that, as per things that you brought up, that we've read in Apolito's text, it seems like there is something to this approach with IIT that has very similar premises. But one thing that is interesting, I mean, like, one thing that seems very, very, a bit more obscure, like I feel like I can make some parallels that convince me enough of there being something to it that I would investigate further, like what we were talking about with point organizations and logic, but also the sort of spatialized logic perhaps, and so on. But one thing that I find hard to connect, and I'm not sure if this is because with IIT it's made to treat a particular object of inquiry, which is consciousness, where its interiority is such an enigma and only for that case is the intrinsic aspect relevant, or if there is a counterpart to this as well on the broader project we've been discussing. Because it seems to me that every time you mobilize that distinction, intrinsic and extrinsic, it has a counterpart on the idea of having partial or total information, right? It seems like extrinsic views are always seeing more, or they're not interested. I mean, they're not trying to model how something appears to itself. They're trying to model its functioning without that kind of localized standpoint, right? Or without situating it, perhaps. I'm not sure if you guys feel like if there is any intuition that comes to mind as to how this intrinsic approach kind of translates into these other issues, you know, like if it also carries, if it also brings some new ideas into the table, you know. It seems obviously. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, can I? One thing I guess I want to contest a little bit with what you said is about the extrinsic view being kind of. What did you say? Like I guess like more free from constraints, or like.
Yeah, that's not what it is. Right?
More with like full information.
Yeah.
I don't know if that I would think of it as like extrinsic it's looking at whatever it is outside, but like relative to what world it's in. So given that like you know what world it's in, like where it's embedded, because I'm thinking of like, I guess like a mathematical example, right? If you think of a manifold, you can talk about it intrinsically as the points and how they relate to one another. Or you can think of it sort of embedded within a space, and depending on the space it's in, it could look very different. Like for example, an easy example is like a Klein bottle, which is a famous like non-orientable surface. In 3 dimensions, it like intersects itself, and it has to intersect itself. And it's impossible for it not to, but if you lift it to a 4th dimension, it can actually like be separated. And that's like kind of, I guess, abstract, but I think whenever you talk about looking at something extrinsically, it always depends on what that like extrinsic world is the first.
Yeah, I think I agree. I totally, yeah, it makes sense to me. Like, yeah, it's much better way. That makes much more sense, right? I'm not sure if that correlates exactly with what Renzo was saying, but it's generally, it seems to me like extrinsic is the analysis that situates some system on a broader one, right? Or whereas intrinsic is just that system from its own perspective, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't map into transcendentally and immanently, but kind of. And I was thinking, just because, I mean, we discussed, especially I think in one of the first meetings, we spoke about, for example, going back to the issue of competition and things like this, and Raquel was saying, as she mentioned today, like competition is a very important signal, because it is, let's say, the intrinsic appearance of something that doesn't appear intrinsically in any other way, right? You don't get to see, like, you don't get to guide your decisions via the distribution of total capital. There's this much capital available, I can do this and invest this and that. The actual movements in the organic composition of capital, how much a capitalist is gonna invest in new machinery or not, and things like this, are done laterally by the relation between capitalists, which is called competition, right? So competition is, let's say, something very much concerned with how capitalism appears to itself, right? And that's also how we treated a transformation problem. We were saying, it seems like prices of production and this sort of distribution of an averaging of surplus value in terms of profit rates and so on, that is not only, let's say, that's not so much, let's say, further determination so much as almost a reflexive determination, right? In some level, people still produce surplus value in accordance to how Marx discussed labor and value and so on and so forth, but that's not how things appear to the people who are doing it, right? So it's not like once you get to prices of production and the fact that capitalists are working through rates of profit, it doesn't mean that the old theory was left behind, but that old theory is a sort of substrate that can never really be measured, or it doesn't really get, it constrains what can appear, but the way that things actually appear to us is not like that. All, practically without exception, businessmen, if you ask them why they are like adding such a rate of profit, they won't say, because I'm exploiting, like everyone exploits laborers in such a way, and this leads to this total capital, and then this, we fight over who will get what share. You just get this theory of, well, I risked so much, and therefore there is an extra earning that I'm entitled to that is also ruled by the marketplace, because if I overcharge, if I add too much of a profit rate, people will go to some other competitor, so I need to keep it within the 20% kind of average, right? So that's, let's say, that reasoning doesn't substitute the actual cause of surplus value having to do with labor, but it seems kind of decoupled. It's a very intrinsic thing, right? So I don't know. Yeah, I'm bringing this up because I remembered this from our meeting, and it seems connected somehow, because we seem to be pushing to read those later developments of Marx regarding price and prices of production as a sort of folding up, right? That's why this Jorge Grespan guy calls it the mode of representation in capitalism, sort of loosely called cognitive mapping of the structure to itself, right? Rather than as a further development that undoes what came before. Even though it has consequences, of course, it's not just like a vague thing. Because it's the sort of signal that leads capitalists to invest, for example, in transforming the organic composition of capital to a point that leads the profit rates to decrease, in fact, right? So there is an important contradiction there. But so it just led me to think about this intrinsic extrinsic distinction, and if it isn't relevant, especially because when we talk about, like when we go back to Apolito's approach, and she says, well, here's a measure where capitalism actually does poorly. Like it's not a measure where competition and capitalist social relations are high up on the phi function. They would be, from this perspective, they're not, let's say, what Marx called the anarchic aspect of capitalism, which I think she wouldn't agree with, but this sort of, it's hierarchy for the companies and anarchy in between companies, right? That would lead to a lot of noise and not so much to some very rich in effective information system. So
what did you mean by the applying like the intrinsic extrinsic difference to these like two stories about like where surplus value comes from? You're trying to relate. I didn't see the connection exactly.
Yeah, no, I'm improvising. I don't know. I just think that my first question was if you guys see a clear, or if you have an intuition as to the value of an intrinsic view when we move from the discussion around consciousness, where the intrinsicality of consciousness is one of the properties to be explained. Therefore, an intrinsic view is inherently interesting, right? Let's say if you were to produce two perspectives, one that only explains extrinsically and one that explains intrinsically, if all the other factors are the same, it seems to me that the intrinsic view would be more interesting, because the existence of something called consciousness is related to it having some singular interiority. So for consciousness, I can understand why that's a very important property to look for. And I'm wondering if there is if you guys can see or think about a counterpart for this for other analysis, right? Why is this, why is the privileging of an intrinsic view, why does it seem interesting in itself, or if it does, right? And the only thing that came to mind quickly was that we did discuss something like this when we're talking about how economic systems appear to themselves, right? That there is a difference between, for example, producing a theory of capitalism that is trying to kind of account for it based, for example, on the nature of human beings. That seems to me the equivalent of an extrinsic approach, where people are like this. That's the source of what's going on, right? That's how it stabilizes when people are like this. And then you get to the sort of, and that's actually how microeconomics sometimes explains this surface structure of prices, profit rates, and so on. Like, people can exchange with each other once a certain demand and supply curves meet, and I'm willing to part with what I have, and you're willing to part with what you have, and so on. Well, that's how profit works. It's the same principle. Like, I can add this much to my product, and you're still willing to buy it because that share is rational in that sense, right? So that's kind of explaining profit rates and how this sort of structure is appearing and how it makes a difference by referring back to something which would be like the natural substrate of an economy. People are looking to maximize utility and so on, right?
And Gabriel, there's something important. I think that there isn't any extrinsic view to the totality of capital. I think this is the point. This is why Marx insists in competition, because what would appear as an extrinsic view, in fact, appears as competition between the individual capitals. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I'm talking the same thing as you are, but I think this is very important. The fact that the totality of capital doesn't have an extrinsic view. You cannot see it from outside. It works like that. It only appears as the relation between capitals in the competition. And that's why you can think maybe competition and cooperation, like Apolito was trying to do, together, because the totality of the capital only appears in competition. Mm-hmm. I know that she's talking cooperation in another sense there, but if you think for a little bit, cooperation there as totality, it makes sense. Totality appears as competition.
Yeah,
I wanted to think about that, because we have this idea also that capitalism is an allocative mechanism, right? It's a way of taking the total product and allocating it back into society in terms of what labor should work on, basically, how labor and resources should be channeled or structured. Isn't that kind of an extrinsic view? I mean, because I'm just thinking about, like, if you compare like a Soviet or so just a central planning system to capital, don't you kind of get that sense of an extrinsic, even if it, has its own problems? Because for an individual capital, yeah, you don't really care about allocating you're allocating as a means to an end. You're allocating resources so that you can achieve more profit and you can beat your competitors. That's a certain viewpoint. But then there is another viewpoint, which is to say that, you have a total amount of labor and resources in a society, and you need to partition that up to solve certain problems of society. So isn't that like two different viewpoints? I don't know if that...
Yeah, that goes very closely to what I was trying to say, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know. When you think about this coordination, you try to make it work by how can I say that, by making competition work. I know what you're saying. I know that there is a state that is coordinating something. It's not just the market, but the state must make competition work in a way. I don't know.
No, but I think he was agreeing with you in that point, though, that to describe capitalism as an allocative mechanism, to say that allocation of resources is its end, that's what it does, is extrinsic, because intrinsically capitalists look at allocation as a means for profit, which is competition, right? So I think it's, the reason why I think this is interesting is just because it seems to me that there is a similarity between the problems that IIT faces for trying to deal with a black box which is interesting because of its inner structure. You don't want to simply be comparing inputs and outputs indefinitely. You want to be able to, like, the interesting thing is the how, right, of this thing. You're kind of in the sort of problem that this brings, and the whole discussion on perturbations and how experiments are played in this framework and things like this seems similar to me to the idea that we kind of glossed over, but it's connected, I think, with the idea that, well, there are two ways to approach, let's say, understanding and changing a social system. One is the understanding of the social system from outside, which says this is what it's meant to do. And you can have like theories which justify, rationalize, formalize this sort of broad thing. But it's different, for example, from understanding it from within, where the function of it is not, you can, from a statement like capitalism is a way of socially coordinating and allocating resources. It's actually not really expressible within capitalism. Like, it's always a bit extrinsic. It's always a bit of rationalization, because in practice, that statement is kind of a conditional, like it's a part. You actually say, I'm allocating resources here, I'm employing more people, less people, I'm raising the wages, I'm lowering the wages, I'm changing the product so that something else happens, right? So intrinsically, it never appears as do this, like we do this because we're allocating resources. Like, that's not a effective reasoning. And I think that Adam Smith and then again with Hayek, this is very clearly stated, like the form of appearance of solidarity is egotism, or the form of appearance of, like, or the only way of the form of appearance of social planning is competition, or attempts to affirm solidarity or attempt to affirm planning, they're actually extrinsic to market capitalism. They will be imposing something which is not organic to it, right? So they kind of admit that there is that the way that things appear from inside are inverted, and that there is no right picture of this from inside. That right picture from of what it actually does. We want solidarity, we want allocation of resources, we want planning. That's always extrinsic. That always comes from, let's say, it actually will make it, it seems like it will make it more controlled or more driven towards its end, but it will actually make it go the wrong way, right? So state planning, altruism, these things actually impinge actual altruism, actual planning and coordination. So there seems to be a certain kind of implicit assumption in liberal economics about adopting, or at least for some economists, of adopting this inner view. And then you have, of course, all the economists who try to give the extrinsic view and say, look, this is the system of allocating resources according to happiness or whatever, right? But no one thinks in that way. Like, that's not a concept of the economic space. It's a concept about the economic space, right? Like, to talk about happiness or to talk about allocation of resources in capitalism is not expressible in a capitalist way. It's something you can say about capitalism, but the actual form of expression of that sort of statement is competition, right? Competition is the form of appearance of the totality, exactly as Raquel was saying, right? So it seems like this is an advantage, like this is problematic, because when you adopt the extrinsic view under certain presuppositions, you can lead to the conclusion that this is well, it's impossible to discuss other systems, because all other systems imply an extrinsic view, and therefore all other systems are gonna kind of suffocate the dynamics of the system, right? So that's how Hayek complains about socialism. But I think what we're doing in this whole discussion about how something appears to itself, what is its intrinsic view, and that it's interesting because you can start comparing how different systems appear to themselves, right? So you don't have to have one. You can start talking about, okay, what is the internal consistency of whatever system you're talking about? And it doesn't need to match its external expression, right? Even though the powers of our system to express true propositions about themselves are, as per Gödel, always restricted.
I think Gabriel dropped, or he's frozen for me.
Yeah, he cut out.
Oh, really?
Yeah, here too.
It looks like he's thinking about something now. Which is betterment of society or something.
Just you.
Okay, I'm back. Are you guys?
Oh,
did it drop to you? Did it drop for you guys as well, or just for me?
No, it was just you. It was just you.
Let me just tell you
that
everything I was saying after you cut off was very good, but sorry.
I want to add one thing, actually, sort of on like a more general level about like this whole extrinsic intrinsic. I think when you take like an extrinsic viewpoint, you generally want, like, your main concern of like maybe why it might not work or might not generalize is like the space you're working in and what that implies about this extrinsic view, right? So like how the world you're in affects how you're seeing it. But with an intrinsic view, since you're sort of like given how it is, sort of like more immediately, not from the outside, it then becomes a question of like the two properties of the sheaves. It's the gluing and the compatibility. So then that like determines sort of like, that's like you in a world is more like intrinsic. You're like inside whatever space you're talking about. And to like investigate that space, you have to understand how the space like is logically connected, and then like you can sort of do experiments in there and then get a global picture. So it's like one is more a question of logic, one is more a question of like filtering through a world, I think.
Because you see, like this actually connects to things that I find important. I mean, of course, Raquel was saying this, and this is crucial, that there is an institution that that in a way pretends like it sees the whole, which is the state. Like, of course, the state doesn't. The state is actually subjected to competition and needs to make competition work, so on and so forth. But you could argue that it supposedly has some better grasp of something that is going on. But actually, in terms of economic practice, like the actual appearance of economic space to its inhabitants is not as economy, is as firms, cooperatives, unions, like is as organizations, right? And the sort of sort of constrained space of what can be done and what cannot be done in terms of how you organize, disorganize, and things like this. So I wonder if there isn't a nice kind of jump, you know, because like if this doesn't give us a nice kind of argument for the connection between economy and organization theory, in the sense that organizations are always too local, right? For in every text you read about them, they always seem like one step towards something bigger that will change the economy. But it might be also because there is a shift in perspective, like from within, for the inhabitants of a social system, there is no such thing as the economy. No wonder that we only refer to the economy in a social system in a sort of ideological abstract way, whereas practical, consequential decision-making affects organizations, even monetary organizations, but nonetheless, money is not the same as the economy, right? So there might be an interesting kind of shift of perspective in that sense, that rather than treating as, let's say, quantitatively different scales, organizations and the economy, you can also treat them as a sort of, well, if you see all the space in which all these organizations are embedded, you call that space the economy. Well, but you need to be kind of outside of it to talk about it in those terms. But you can also invert the perspective and talk about what it means to inhabit that space, right? And then economy could even be defined as the set of constraints on free association, right? If free association is the null hypothesis where like everything is kind of trivially possible, right? You probe into the cause-effect structure of an economy by seeing what can happen and what cannot happen in it, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know, like I'm pushing this, but I feel like there is something interesting there.
Yeah, it does feel like there's a connection.
Yeah, I think like those strategies, like we talked about with venture communism and dual power, those seem to be more intrinsic because they require negotiating the space, the constraints. You know, they're not simply like saying abolish, but they're also not simply saying work within, like form better businesses, and you know, it's something in between, right? It's like within the constraints, but still trying to create something new. I don't know if you guys.
No, it makes sense to me. I mean, dual power. I think for the dual power, which is a maximal partition theory, right? You actually want to see if you can divide a social system in such a way that there is a whole set of causes and effects that will not be referred back to trivially existing economic constraints, but to this other thing, right? Like the Soviets are running. That means that there will be effects on the world that will respect the partition you just made of that world. Some effects concern the Soviets; they don't concern the state, right? Some decisions you'll not be able to say this is what happens. You will say this was decided by the Soviets or something like this. Like there are some of the few names I think we've ever came up with in the history of leftist organizations for intrinsic systemic ideas, right? Like it's not really like it doesn't make sense to talk dual power either in local or global terms. Like, it makes no, like a cooperative is not in itself engaged in dual power structure. but there is no other specific form of organization, which is like, it's actually the way you glue stuff together that defines if this is a strategy or not, right?
Yeah, it's not the individual cooperatives, it's the network.
Yeah.
And the network has to achieve some level of closure such that, you know, I mean, on a practical level, that it can self-reproduce without outside investment, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't need, like, unlike charities, for example, or nonprofits, in which like every year you have to go and ask for donations. So you end up, even if you yourself are not, let's say, a profitable enterprise, you have to kind of parasitize the profitable enterprises to sustain yourself. But dual power implies that you're out of that cycle. You don't need to ask for money, basically.
Yeah, it seems to me like dual power, the Black Panthers idea of a nation inside the nation, it has a similar gist to it, right? Like to produce an internal coherent structure which is not identifiable with any one of its subsystems. Like the Black nation of Black Panthers is not the community service, it's not security on the streets, is not education, it's none of those things. It's the fact that they are kind of networked together in a way that when you ask why of a certain effect, the answer refers back to that network. It doesn't refer to the world at large, right? So why are these kids fed like their big feeding project for young children right before school? Like, why are kids getting better at school? The answer is not because the general conditions of living are getting better, like systemic answer. The answer is now running across the partition that they made. Like, it only concerns that network, like, because these guys did this, right? So the reason why I'm saying this is because there seems to be a kind of a connection between the methodology that allows you to analyze something intrinsically, a certain way to approach cause and effect and constraints, and in a way that to do this, you don't really privilege elements, right? But you end up privileging the gluing of these elements, right? So it's not about any local agenda, but about the conditions for local agendas to cohere together, right? And I think that kind of leads back to Apolito's text, because her conclusion out of IIT is that you can kind of reframe the problem of large-scale organization in terms of connected, like instruments of connection and instruments of complexity, which I find it's a bit too quick for me. I'm not sure I follow exactly how this, like, what is the counterpart of this in actual world organization, because in a certain sense, it seems very tailored to internet stuff, like P2P systems and Sci-Hub and things like this. I can see how they increase complexity because they make stuff circulate, but it's easy to see that where the cost of circulation is zero, right? Or near zero. Like, it doesn't increase with the increase of circulation in a proportional way, because information, unlike like basic resources, you don't alienate, you don't lose it when you share it, right? Whereas if you have food and I share it, I lose the food that I have. Like, it's a slightly different thing. But I don't know, it just seemed to me like there is something nice. There is something nice in the way of reframing the problem, you know, of economic spaces, by kind of pushing the idea that, well, in a certain sense, it's not that nice to have a global theory or a theory that embeds capitalism in a theory of capitalism. like on the global view of capitalism. First, because that's not how people operate inside, right? Or at least not to only have that. So in such a way that it would be preferable to talk about alternative social systems also from an intrinsic perspective, right? So you're not asking to have this sort of total view, because that's already not how this system works, right? And I wonder sometimes if the social calculation problem and the sort of social planning with centralized computers that kind of will generate this sort of distribution, if they don't kind of, you know, they find a way to escape the critique, like Hayek's critique. Social planning is not possible because it's too complex computationally. And they say, no, it's not. It's treatable computationally. But it can still remain extrinsic, right? In the sense that it still is about reaching that total view and not really about acting in a sort of middle ground, in the middle level, in such a way that you guarantee that whatever you do, the coherence is possible, right? I mean, it seems to have a fundamentally distinct approach as the dual power thing we were talking about, and these things which seem more mobilizable, like you can do something about it, right? But usually it's treated as a localist thing or a non-economic and purely political thing. And perhaps there's a way of thinking about it where that's clarified not to be the case. And you don't need to be looking for, let's say, like you can turn the economic discussion in a more clearly organizational sense, because you can show that to describe the economy as a whole is not really how economic thinking expresses itself in practice, you know? Something like that. I'm not sure what I'm saying, but some crazy stuff maybe in that direction.
Maybe a bit of a critique of Paul Cockshott.
Yes, that yes, a bunch of, but
yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. I just think that there might be something to it, you know, and I think it also.
I do like that the intrinsic approach feels more like experimental, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was gonna say. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it feels more it feels like it connects more clearly the idea that, and it also brings into kind of a weird kind of sequence what we're talking about now with like the sort of synoptic economic view versus the view of the inhabitant of the economic space, right? And how this might be a way of shifting organization and economy. Organization as something which has an epistemological gambit, like a wager on understanding a space, because you can organize in some ways and not others, and this tells you something, right? It brings this in line a bit with the whole discussion on the transcendental and worlds and bodies in Badiou, because for all purposes, for him, the transcendental of a world is actually unfathomable, right? From an empirical standpoint, like nothing guarantees that you have access to the infinite kind of differentiation of the space of a world. But even if you don't, we know from a formal theory that whatever that complex kind of ordering structure is, that some strategies can probe into it at the same time that they affect it, right? So it kind of makes that connection a bit clearer, I think, right? That you can have a sort of distinction between, or you can enrich the idea of organization as the local version of the very big thing, which is economy, to think about, let's say, organizations are, let's say, a more intrinsic inhabitant perspective versus something which could only be treated as an object from some bird's eye impossible view. And the third thing that actually falls in line is that it seems like there's something similar within IIT itself, right? Because it can give you a formalism that already implies a lot about stuff. Like, doesn't matter how complex this network is, we know that if it is causally integrated, if it is informationally integrated, some subsystems will have will make more difference than others. From this underlying hypothesis, only a very minimal kind of slot of instance need to be analyzed, even if we don't know exactly what the grain of the analysis is. Like, but it gives you a sort of transcendental picture that you cannot directly apply. And then you have the sort of much more humble sort of experiments, which don't really give that big picture back, but give you, let's say, a more kind of, how do you call this? A more selective entry into that, right? It makes no sense to expect to have an unfolded complete mapping of this whole structure. In some sense, that sort of complication seems to mirror the complication in these other two fields about trying to see the whole at once, or trying to see everything at once, even if it is intrinsically seen, right? I don't know.
I was trying to map like this, like IIT has also these two levels of what the whole, like the system level and the distinctions level. Like, one is the question of whether the whole exists, and the other is the question of which parts within the whole makes a difference to the whole, and to the economic problem. And like the anarchist solution seems to only consider like the consistency of parts, and the rest is kind of like a little bit extrinsic. Like, there's only like the point of view of a community, and it's not clear how they relate within a whole, because there's no point of view of a whole, only the point of view of a certain community, and left or something else to do. It's extrinsic, like you need some abstract artificial point of view to relate these communities. On the other hand, so you have like this need to think of what the relationship between organizations is, right? They have to, their differences are not like differences within the community, but differences for this whole, and they being able to make that difference means that they are kind of like, they feel they fit in this space, economic like exchanges, and then there's the other question of whether, and I think this is not present in IIT, of to what degree does a certain part contains already the whole, like or the point of view of the part itself of the, like, I don't know if in IT that makes sense. Like, what's the point of, how does the part sees the whole? Like, you could do like a difference, like how redundant is the part to the whole or something like that. But it seems to be like one is the point of view how the globe, like the globe, like the whole see the parts, and the other how the part understands the functioning of the whole, right?
But in that thing that you showed us about the callback divergence thing, where it seems like you have a poorer model that keeps the sort of basic structure of the larger model you don't understand. That seems just a bit like that sort of question, right? Which part, which sub part of the partition of the system preserves the information about the whole that's not the whole, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you could. Can you say it again?
Like, because if the way that you the whole Kullback-Leibniz Library. Can you hear me?
Yeah, can you see my screen?
I think I need to.
Okay. Yeah.
I know. Yeah, it's working now. Yeah. So if I understood, like you have this full model that you don't know what causes what, right?
Yeah.
And you try to partition it in such a way that this poorer version of it, I think it's in the slide above, right? I think. Right, try to disconnect it in such a way that the disconnected one, like the distance between the two, is the smallest possible, right?
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if that doesn't capture a bit the idea that that part. I mean, adding what you removed would be almost redundant, right?
Yeah. Yeah, something like that. I mean, you would compare like, I mean, one thing is for you to know how much of a difference you make to the whole is like you actually know that if you were cut out of the whole, you meant losing a lot, right? So
yeah,
more disconnection to the whole means losing a lot to the whole, like but you actually like, so a worker know it's not like causally effective because it knows it could be like disconnected and nothing would happen.
Yeah, but a strike is a nice way of doing that, right? A strike disconnects something that makes a big difference, right? Which is not people, it's actually the productive chain. You're not disconnecting along the line of workers, which is just there. It just plays into the reserve army of labor, but you want to disconnect in such a way that the production line is stopped, right?
Yeah.
So you're not disconnecting as people, like removing people from the line, but you're removing labor force, right? Of whoever it is. So
it's more like a maximal cut, right?
yeah, that would be a maximum. Like it makes the whole point is that it would make the whole difference, right? It would prove that, like that's a way of proving that labor was the cause, because if you stop labor and then the factory stops, then the difference came from that part, right?
It's almost something that like increases the size of the, I guess, like appearance of labor to like capital, right?
Yeah.
Like that's what a strike does. It says like because capital normally is like, oh, labor, like we can extract all the labor from you. But then a strike is like a flipping of that script, showing that like where power really lies, right? So
Yeah,
it makes it like greater in a way.
Because I mean, there is that idea, I mean, which is very dear to a whole strain of Marxism, and I think that in a certain sense, Badiou also keeps to it, which is that when for example, workers strike, you get a set with the organization of workers that the classic slogan from the International, right? It seemed like they had minimal value. They made minimal difference within the factory, but when they leave, you can see that they are everything, right? From we're nothing, we're going to be everything. Like that maximization. Once you decouple the factory from the worker, you decouple something that within the factory looks like it's nothing, and everything comes from the factory dynamics itself. But once those two things are separated, you feel like the whole is more apparent in the part that you removed than in the part that was left, right? So workers look like they run the thing, right? So that whole idea that of something concrete and local, but it has universal properties, the whole concrete universality stuff, right? which I think goes a bit in what you were saying, like parts that look like the whole.
Yeah.
I think also
this reminds me of the from your translation of that Badiou chapter on non-principal ultrafilters, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's something what a strike is. It's like large parts that differentiate like a yes versus a no, where the base of it is kind of like large enough that it kind of like envelops the whole thing. We'll get into that next week, I hope.
Yeah.
So
yeah, but I think that there is a connection to this, and
yeah.
And what was I going to say? That yeah, I mean, and in fact, that this is the point, right? Let's say the moment that a strike, for example, it's funny because, like, when you read about many cases of strikes, you can see that 99% of the time, the issue of a strike is not decoupling from the factory, but the network of connections you need to create outside of the factory to maintain that cut, right? So you stop a factory, but first thing that can happen, you're all fired and someone else comes in your place. So you need to undo that connection, but you need to have a whole network of relations with other workers to be able to sustain that. Then you need a network of connections with everyone around in the media and so on, because the question of do you approve or disapprove of this strike becomes a relevant one. And if nobody approves of the strike, the chance that you can maintain yourself during the strike, find other means of survival while you're not getting paid, and all those things, they get in line. So the strike seems like it's meant to disconnect on the one side, right? And it could be, in that sense, a sort of emblem that workers make a difference. But the actual organizational problem is a matter of connecting the workers on strike with a network that makes that strike consistent. Otherwise, it can only endure one day, right? So I think in that sense, it's usually where the problem of universality comes in, because is the idea exactly that a small part or a certain part, right, which is the striking workers, that they can be big enough or complex enough as a sort of set of connections and a sort of ecosystem with society that it can be held, right? That's a general strike. That's the basic idea, right? General strike implies that there is more complexity in the strike than in the general functioning of the system. Because it's not a matter of decreasing. I think that's interesting to think about, right? I mean, it's not a matter of simply decreasing activity, because the decrease of activity of workers in a factory implies an increase of activity somewhere else. Like, it's not trivial at all to stop working, or especially for many sectors to stop working. Like, you still need to eat, you still go home, there's still people who need to decide if that can continue or not. So I think part of the argument goes through this, part of the problem goes through the thing you're talking about, Hanzo, about evaluating from which parts you can see the whole better, right? And I think that it is in a sense, at least classically it was, a struggle between money and strikes, right? What is the part of the system where you can see the system better, like the whole better, from the standpoint of a circulation of money? Because that's pretty much, like, if you follow the money, you pretty much follow where things are going, right? And what's going on, and you kind of can see in a sort of cynical way, well, if the workers are paid more, the strike is done. So money rules over, even the strike proves that money rules over everything. Or you get the other side where, well, if a general strike was held and it kind of endures, then there is something more global that from the standpoint of money you couldn't see, right? Because from the money standpoint, there is no reason not to work. So I think that there is, it's very questionable if this still holds that nicely, or if it ever did. But I think you can frame that whole discussion in similar terms.
There's also from the exchange side, the boycotting, which is the same kind of structure, right? But just refusing to buy from a specific producer.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, right? Because you could start talking about comparing boycotts and strikes from the standpoint of integrated information. Like, most people say that boycotts don't work because they are ineffective partitions, right? Like, if you cut the link between consumer and some commodity, like, you're just gonna have some other consumer. Like, no link is strong enough to make a difference at the level of consumption. Like, I think that's the formal argument behind the weakness of boycotts, right? Like, ultimately, like, if you stop consuming, there's so much like the network on the side of production is much smaller, like the amount of nodes, because the amount of people putting their work in is actually limited compared to the amount of people buying products out, right? So the amount of connections on the side of consumption is so much higher, and each individual one is so much less relevant, that boycotts is like cutting a big chunk of a system that doesn't really change anything, whereas cuts in the production would change, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I think you can actually translate that into a more quantitative approach, where it's not really so qualitative. I mean, Marxists usually argue for this in a qualitative sense, like, oh, but work is the substance, therefore production and interruption of production is better because it's substantial. But you could make a quantitative formal argument that is not based on any ontology, like, or any general ontological view. Like, it might be cases where consumption cuts deeper, right, than production. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky problem, yeah. Because of the amount of effort to maintain the complexity of a strike is much higher per person than the amount of effort, you could say, to avoid buying something. But
yeah, we could calculate this.
In general, it's like,
we could calculate this. Like, we establish a certain cost for not consuming something in terms of organization, right? And then you can have a certain relation between the amount of people that need to stop consuming for it to be an effective cut of the system that actually makes a difference, right? And the actual, let's say, organizational cost of this, which implies many more people, right? So, but it's at the same time smaller per person in terms of consumption. And you can have on the other side a higher cost of organizing for production, because if you stop production, you need to survive some other way. But you have a lower, the amount of people that needs to stop supposedly smaller, right? So you could start kind of playing with that stuff. And I bet that there are some conditions in which boycotts might make more sense, and some conditions under which strikes might make more sense, and things like this. Like, you can imagine these things, I guess.
And just another thing about the complexity of the part, we can think about that form of income from the venture communism. Do you remember, Gabriel?
Yeah.
We can think about if that form of income is complex enough to impose something into the system, you know. I was thinking about it when we were talking about this.
I really think that that's a nice way to because, I mean, I'm not sure if everyone was already, if we got to discuss this as part of this group, but a while back we were reading into this idea that I always forget his name. What's his name then? It's Dimitri Kleiner.
Kleiner, I think.
Kleiner.
Like the Klein bottle.
Yeah, this guy, he wrote
nice.
Nice. He wrote a manifesto called the Telecommunist Manifesto, and then one of Cockshot's kind of fellow travelers, this guy called Ian Wright, he picked up on it, where he used a similar idea. He did something similar to Apolito, which was to take an idea from more kind of information, internet space, and think about it in like actual world, which was this idea of a venture commune. And the venture commune would be composed of two types of organizations. One is the commune itself, which would be a structure that owns assets, and the other would be a set of cooperatives that rent from the commune the assets of the commune. So the commune it owns a bunch of computers, and then we want to make some product like a telemarketing thing, or for example, the institute here in Brazil that we need computers. So we rent them from the commune and we pay the commune, right? So the commune receives that money, and it also receives money from selling and buying its own assets, right? And our cooperative now has the rented computers, and it does its own thing, so it gets the income from clients, for example. But the idea of the venture commune is that everyone who is in the cooperative is also part of the commune. So when we rented from the commune the computers, we're actually renting from this venture institution of which we are shareholders. So we don't only get the variable income that comes from the cooperatives, but we get a sort of basic income that is the shares paid by the commune to the people that are organized in it. So everyone in the cooperative gets variable income based on their work in the cooperative, and a fixed income that comes from the shares of the commune that received all the rent money from the equipment, right? I remember that Raquel mentioned this. Tell me if I'm correct, but like I remember that you said like, well, but it's funny because
your audio it just cut out for a minute.
Fuck. Man, my life is Why? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's better.
Yeah, I don't know if I got to the end of the commune explanation. Like, so yeah, the idea of the fuck. Okay. Yeah, but we were talking about if this basic kind of fixed income slash variable income, right? If it doesn't have a sort of kind of, if it doesn't mirror in a way the structure of prices of production, which have production cost slash profit rate in its composition, right? Am I talking to myself again?
I think Bolsonaro is trying to limit your speech. It's just like very choppy.
Shit.
Yeah, this is interesting though. Can you send that the paper about the venture communism?
Dennis just sent it in the chat window.
Oh, he did. Oh, perfect.
But Raquel, I'm sorry, I totally interrupted you because I just remembered that perhaps people didn't know the idea right behind it. But
it's Ian Wright.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
No, I was just saying that. I mean, I interrupted you just to recapitulate what the hell that idea was, but you were talking about if this way of organizing income, right? This sort of
yeah, because the question for me is that now we are thinking about the basic income and things like that, you know. But if you put the question in the other way that we are doing here, if we can see some parts of the system that acts in a complex way that can change something in the system, I think it's better to think like that than to go from upside down, you know. But I don't know.
No, I totally, you know why I agree with you? Because, for example, what's nice about the venture commune idea is that, I mean, I don't have I'm without my crazy pen, but right, the venture commune is like this. So here's the commune. And here's like a bunch of cooperatives. And the idea is, right, that we rent from this and we pay back. This is a money sign. I swear to you. I'm not like Dennis, like an artist with the mouse pad. I'm here. So, and then we rented something here, some asset. Now we can get money from the outside with our own work. And we paid something to the venture commune, right? But everyone who is in the cooperative is also here, which means
where's that money coming from?
Here from clients. Like, for example, this is selling some service, right? So you get some variable income here based on how much money we made, like with our service, and it's conditioned on how much money we made and what is the cooperative's inner rules for distribution, right? So by labor time, by equitative distribution, we don't know, but there is some variable there. And since everyone is part of the venture commune, there is a second income that comes from here, which is based on, let's say, your shares of the commune and how much the commune rented in that period, right? And this gives you a fixed income because it's the same for everyone. So you see part
to the cooperative or to individuals?
To individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Because all individuals that are in a cooperative, they're also by transitivity in the commune, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can have more cooperatives here, a bunch of them. And the idea is that ultimately your income, it has two factors, right? It has one variable that reflects a local labor conditions, like or local organizational conditions, like, okay, we worked less, I worked less this month, or work wasn't that good, so I got less, like in cooperatives. Of course, you can have a lot of means to kind of accommodate the risk. Like, of course, things are not so simple, but still it's variable per worker, right? But you also get a fixed part, which reflects something else, right? It reflects the ecology of the commune, because it's also depends on this arrow, right? My fixed income here depends on if these other people rented something and paid for it, right? It depends perhaps on the relation between this venture commune and another, because they might have also exchanged something, done something here. So this part of your income, which is a kind of basic rent, right? It is actually interconnected with an organizational ecology, which is slightly different from the basic rent that the state provides or promises to provide, where that connection is kind of equally invisible, or it's not even the matter of it's visible or invisible, right? But it doesn't carry information about anything.
Yes, yeah, that's my point. When you see this kind of income that the venture communism can pay, you see the origin of, you see where it comes from, you know.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about basic income, you don't know. You just know that this basic income doesn't have a counterpart in work, for example.
Mm-hmm.
But you don't know where it comes from. And when you see this problem in the venture community, you can see the origin. That's why I think the complexity is good. I know.
Yeah, I totally agree. But and I think also it's nice because it's not to say that I can reconstruct the complete causal chain from this to the whole network. You might not be able, right? But you kind of know the plane of consistency of it. I think that like it's important also because I think that sometimes as we were talking about, like it's sometimes we confuse visibility with the extrinsic view, right? As if to know or to be implicated in the sort of or to make visible a certain network of relations in an economic system means to see it from afar, or see it from without, right? But even in this case, let's say, even if you ask a worker here in this venture commune to say exactly how this value is constructed, he might not know, but it's still in some sense visible, right? I mean, it's still in some sense dependent on some variables and not all variables, right? It's not dependent on anything. Like, for example, the case of basic rent, basic income, where you simply don't know where it comes from, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's the point. You have more consistency, and it doesn't have anything to do with being able to see something or not. You have consistency. It is exactly that.
I gotta head out soon,
yeah, I need to do dinner here, so
okay.
Yeah, this is a very interesting talk though.
I like the idea of ending on, you know, venture communism and crazy income structure. I mean, we definitely could spend some time more detailed on that. Like, that's also a nice topic to kind of discuss in detail, I guess. So it's another good idea.
Yeah. Maybe I can do that in the future.
That would be nice.
That would be great. Yeah.
Okay, so I'll see you guys next week.
Okay.
Okay, guys. Sleep well.
Bye.
Take care.
Take care.
Peace.
Meeting.
Bye.